Okay, perfect. So first up today, we have a remote speaker. Our speaker is Patricia Cho, and I'm excited to have her give a talk today as a fellow laboratory astrophysicist. So Patricia comes from a kind of interesting background. She's currently a PhD candidate in the astronomy department at the University of Texas at Austin. But before that, she attended Williams College in Massachusetts, where she studied applied linguistics. She worked at Master Carr for a little while, and then she also worked as a farmhand at organic farms on the Pacific Northwest before she decided she totally wanted to change her career. So she returned to school and she studied astrophysics at Columbia University, which she thought would mark the beginning of her career as an observational astronomer. Little did she know, in graduate school, she found the prospect of making cosmic matter and terrestrial laboratories irresistible, which I can certainly understand. She now serves as the PI of the expanding foil photoionized plasma experiments conducted on the Z machine at Sandia National Laboratories. So with that, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I guess I'll just jump right in. I'm not sure if the flavor of this talk is fairly different from what you normally hear. So, but hopefully there's some interesting things you can take away. Okay, so I'll tell you today about the work I've been doing mostly for my dissertation, performing laboratory tests of astrophysical black hole accretion disk plasma models, in particular X-star, using the Z machine at Sandia National Labs. I'll just briefly mention or say thank you to my long and growing list of collaborators without whom this work wouldn't be possible. Okay, so this is a summary / outline of the talk. The upshot is really that the iron spectra that we've been collecting from our laboratory photoionized plasmas seem to suggest that X-star in particular may significantly underpredict absolute emission intensity. Our motivation comes specifically from something called the supersolar iron abundance problem, which some of you may be familiar with, and also the fact that there have been recently some new theoretical developments that seem to inform the problem. But this question, are the detailed physical assumptions underlying the model calculations accurate, remains an open one in the absence of any experimental data available to benchmark the calculations. So we built this photoionized plasma platform at Sandia, which is a national laboratory in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And we can use the platform to get to actual astrophysical temperature and density conditions, the actual conditions of the accretion disks that we care about. We can independently measure the plasma conditions, in particular the temperature and the density. And our aim really is to produce some of the first benchmark laboratory data that can be used to test the model calculations in detail. The upshot really is that so far what we're seeing is that X-star seems to underpredict iron L-shell emission intensity specifically. This is the spectral range that we've managed to measure so far in the lab. And my claim is that what we're seeing could partly explain the supersolar iron abundances, with some major experimental caveats that I'll talk about toward the end of the talk. Okay, so I'll go into a little bit of background here, and I've sort of curtailed this part of the talk from what I normally the talks that I normally give, because I'm assuming that this audience is a little bit more familiar with sort of the astrophysical context. But there's this sort of long-standing puzzle that some of you may know about, which is why are iron abundance estimates in black hole accretion disks too high? So as I'm sure you know, fits to emission spectra, which include the superposition of both the coronal X-ray emission as well as the X-rays reflected off of the disk, can be used to infer fundamental parameters of these systems, things like the mass and the spin of the black hole, as well as iron abundance, among other things. And the point to make here is that stellar evolution theory suggests that we should expect to see solar elemental abundances elsewhere in the universe. But what we're seeing in these inferences of the iron abundances in these systems is that they're often many times what we see in the sun. So the expected solar iron abundance is plotted there on the right. I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but in green. And this histogram shows you the distribution of inferred iron abundances for a subset of roughly 30 black hole systems, including both AGN as well as black hole binaries. So you can see that for most of the systems, the inferred iron abundance is several times what we see in the sun, and the number can reach as high as 20. So the hypothesis, or one sort of prevailing hypothesis, was that it had to do with this historical cap on electron density at 10 to the 15. My understanding is that newer data suggests that the actual densities in these accretion disks reach several orders of magnitude higher than that, up to 10 to the 18 to 10 to the 22. And recently, one of the most widely used astrophysical accretion disk plasma models, X-star, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, was updated to include effects that more accurately capture the physics at these higher densities. This includes things like a revised treatment of continuum lowering, suppression of dielectronic recombination rates, things like that. And if you compare the inferred iron abundances obtained using the old low density version of the model, which are indicated, a few of which are indicated to the right here for this handful of objects, to the values that you get if you fit the spectra with the new higher density version of X-star, can see that in general, or I should say overall, the values are somewhat closer to solar, but in many cases they remain stubbornly high. And neither the old nor the new density version of X-star, of course, has been tested in detail against any laboratory emission data. So that's really where we come in with the photoionized plasma platform experiment at Sandia. And I'll spend a little bit more time sort of in this portion of the talk than I normally do, because I'm assuming that this is the bit that most of you are less familiar with. So on the right, what you're seeing is a half cut out cartoon schematic of the Z machine. I'm going to skip a lot of the detail and just sort of bring your attention to two things here. The first is the what's labeled the Marx generator. It's a set of capacitors that are arranged sort of along the perimeter of the machine, and they're basically massive batteries that can store up to 22 megajoules of energy. We use the energy stored in those capacitors and compress all of that in both space and time, concentrated at the center to produce the X-ray powers that we need to drive the macroscopic plasmas, right? In my case, in particular, the photoionized plasmas, to astrophysical temperatures and densities, to astrophysical regimes. So at the center, the mechanism that we use to deliver the X-rays is what's known as a double nested tungsten wire array. You're only seeing one of the arrays here, but imagine there's a second array with a larger diameter outside of this, but I wanted to simplify it just for illustrative purposes. So all of the energy that's stored in the capacitors is released and produces 26 million amps of current that are sent through these wire arrays. And that current produces a strong magnetic field, and of course the J cross B force vaporizes the tungsten wires, turns it into a plasma, and compresses it to stagnation. Once it reaches stagnation, the plasma then launches a shock back outward, and the subsequent outwardly propagating X-rays are the X-ray drive spectrum that I use to irradiate my samples and drive my photoionized plasmas. All of the energy that's stored in those capacitors is released in a 3.5 nanosecond full width half max pulse, so it's extremely fast. And what it means is that Z can produce X-ray powers that are in excess of 15 times the capacity of the entire world's power plants. If you zoom in to the very center, the section labeled center section here, inside of this sort of chamber, what you would see is depicted by this cartoon schematic. So the point I want to make here is just that the platform fields 2 emission and 2 absorption diagnostics or spectrometers simultaneously, and I measure roughly 10 spectra on every shot. In chamber, the 2 diagnostics that I use are emission diagnostics. The first is called the XRS cubed. I use this one to collect time integrated emission spectra, and an example of that is pictured in the top right here. We use film in this diagnostic just because the debris scenario sort of precludes the ability to use electronic detectors for the most part. This diagnostic at the bottom here, this is called the monster emission diagnostic. This is a fairly new addition to the platform. And it, for the first time, allows us to use electronic detectors to collect time-resolved emission spectroscopy down to integration windows of 2 nanoseconds. And then not pictured here, there are 2 pixel absorption diagnostics that sit a bit further away from the center of the machine. And these 2 diagnostics look directly through the foil sample at the Z-pinch, which produces a backlit absorption spectrum, and you can see an example of that here. So if you stepped inside of this cylinder, this is a debris shield that protects the spectrometers from damage. What you'd see at the very center is pictured in the top left here. This is the central 5 centimeters, so it's a very, very small area. And this gold return current canister at the center of that is where the Z-pinch is produced. There are I should say, windows cut out of this gold return current canister, which allow the X-rays produced by the Z-pinch to propagate outward and irradiate my foil sample. And these foil samples that I use are initially very thin, roughly 800 angstroms thick, with anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 angstroms of plastic tamping on either side, sandwiching the actual iron layer. And the thickness of that plastic tamper material is what we use to control the density. So the thicker the tamper, the less the expansion, the higher the volumetric density during the experiment. You can see in the cartoon schematic that I arrange my emission spectrometer and my absorption spectrometer perpendicular to each other to observe the same plasma simultaneously on every shot. And the sample undergoes several thousand times expansion during the experiment. I also collect information about the Z-pinch as far as imaging, as well as power and energy. And in aggregate, all of that information, including the emission and absorption spectra, sort of serve to confirm that the plasma is photoionized and reaching the regimes that we actually care about. So the sort of powerful thing about the platform is that it represents a direct laboratory analog of the accretion system and reaches the actual temperature and density conditions that we care about, which is sort of a new capability that's enabled by the intense X-ray powers right on a megajoule class facility like Z, which of course there are only a handful of in the world. And so I'll build out here sort of my case for how we're building sort of the laboratory analog of the accreting system. So on the left, you're seeing a cartoon schematic side-on view of the accretion disk compact object system, where of course you have coronal X-rays that are irradiating the disk material, driving the photoionization and the associated atomic kinetics, and that absorbed, reprocessed re-radiation, known as the reflection spectrum, is then observed with satellite telescopes out in space. Okay. We know this. The photoionization parameter is sort of the key parameter that's used to characterize these systems. It takes the ionizing flux to electron density ratio and uses that to sort of characterize the degree of ionization one would expect in the system. And then on the right is our laboratory analog. Hopefully you can immediately see the mimicry of the various components. So instead of coronal X-rays, I have Z-pinch X-ray illumination, which vaporizes and expands my foil sample and then drives, similarly, the photoionization and associated atomic kinetics. And then I have a distinct advantage in the laboratory, which is that I can observe the emission and the absorption spectra simultaneously. And again, the thing that I always like to emphasize is that we reach, albeit in a much smaller parameter space, right, a much smaller range of conditions, but we reach the same flux, temperature, and density as we actually observe in the astrophysical systems. So it's a powerful platform that we can use to interrogate the model calculations at the actual conditions that they're intended to be used for, right? And so far, we've used the platform now to collect high signal to noise emission data from photoionized iron, I should say, and silicon plasmas with demonstrated reproducibility, as you can see in the 3 panels to the right here. So the iron film emission data is spectrally resolved in the horizontal direction and spatially resolved in the vertical direction. So we get information about the expansion of the plasma as well. And we've collected data now at 3 different densities, 1 10 to the 18 up to 2.5 or so 10 to the 18 atoms per centimeter cubed. Electron density, you can think of it as being roughly an order of magnitude higher than this. It's a little bit less well constrained at the moment, but there's some ongoing work to characterize the charge state distribution that would tell us the electron density as well. And you can see I've indicated sort of the rough regions in the spectrum and the ion stages that those spectral features come from. You can see we're reaching plus 15, plus 16, plus 17 sodium, neon-like, and fluorine-like ions, which indicates that we're likely in an environment where we're dominated by photon processes. Yeah, some of these may be somewhat obvious, but it bears sort of pointing out that there are several strengths of the platform, including that we can perform repeat experiments to establish reproducibility. The fact that we measure emission and absorption of the same plasma means we can constrain the upper and lower charge states, right, simultaneously, or not charge states, atomic states simultaneously. And we also obtain independent measurements on every shot of the radiation drive, the plasma conditions, and the total integration time. Of course, I don't have time to go into all of these. I'll just focus on the plasma conditions in particular and tell you how we measure the temperature and the density. I'll start with the density, which is a lot simpler. So for the density, the volumetric density measurement, we just take the independent areal density measurements that we get of the sample prior to the shot, before we shoot it on Z. And we measure the lateral expansion size along the space resolved direction of the film image that we collect, and very simply divide that areal density or the column density by the expansion size to get the volumetric density. And that, depending on how you calculate the ionizing radiation flux and your estimate of the electron density, gets us into a regime of roughly 20 to 200 erg centimeters per second for the photoionization parameter. Which is directly within the regime that we care about. The temperature is a little bit more involved and also relies on a couple of assumptions, which you know, the accuracy of which may sort of skew one way or the other, but gets us a temperature estimate that puts us in a ballpark that allows us to sort of make the claim of photoionization a little bit stronger. So the way this works is that we assume partial LTE for low-lying atomic states. Of course, in a general sense, we are very far from LTE in our plasma, but for very low-lying atomic states whose energies are low enough to make them collisionally accessible, even at the moderate, several tens of eV temperatures in our plasma, we can expect that, given the fact that the electron kinetic energy distributions equilibrate to a Maxwellian on the order of picoseconds, we can expect that within the several nanosecond duration of our experiment, that the population ratios of low-lying atomic states will follow the Boltzmann distribution. Of course, there are several assumptions that go into this, but assuming that we can get within the general ballpark temperature of the experiment, of the plasma, it allows us to say something about the strength of the photoionization claim. So the way this works in practice is we take a transmission spectrum. If we observe well-isolated absorption lines like the two indicated here, coming from two or more states whose energies are low enough to be accessible by electron collision, like the ground and first excited state of lithium-like ions, we can use the information from the transmission spectrum to calculate the temperature. So once you establish the assumptions, it's fairly simple. You take the 2J+1 statistical weights, the energy separation of the two lower states of the two absorption transitions, and then calculate the atomic populations using the total integrated transmission, and pop out your temperature, which for our plasma, for our iron plasma, comes out to roughly 41 eV plus or minus 7.5. So even within some range of error under the right, if our assumptions are slightly or if there's a slight departure from our assumption in the actual plasma, the electron temperature is still far too low for us to be reaching the charge states that we actually observe by electron collision. So again, it just sort of strengthens the claim to photoionization. Okay, so that hopefully gives you a picture of the experimental setup. I don't have too much time left, I know, but I wanted to show you some of the results and sort of point out some of the detailed spectroscopic comparisons that we've been able to make with the data. So the first question that I wanted to sort of tease out is does the high density version of XStar actually agree better with the experimental observations? And it seems like sort of in a rough sense, the answer is yes. So what you're seeing here are two sets of calculations done with the high and the low density version of XStar in the top and bottom panels at 25 and 50 eV, which encompasses sort of the electron temperature range that we expect for our plasma. The black curve is the Z data, and then the gray shaded region gives you the standard deviation at the lowest density that we've observed so far, the 110 to the 18 atoms per centimeter cubed. These numbers here are just arbitrary multiplicative scale factors that I applied across the entire spectral range just for visual clarity. And the first thing I want to point out is that the total integrated flux agreement from the low to high density version of XStar seems to improve by a factor of roughly 3 to 4. And what I mean by that is just, if the total integrated flux observed in the spectral range from the Z data divided by the total integrated flux predicted by the model calculation, there's a much better agreement with the new high density version of XStar. But the total flux, assuming that our absolute calibration of the emission intensity is correct, is still underpredicted by more than an order of magnitude, which is fairly significant. If you look at the ion distribution and the mean charge across the two different versions of the code, they seem to vary significantly as well. And the good news is that the new high density version of XStar, the ion charge distribution is much more in line with predictions from other high fidelity laboratory based codes. So these three panels are plotting the same calculations at 25 and 50 eV that were done using prism spectrogram and atomic, which are just a few different laboratory based models. So the comparisons among all of these are starting to show some interesting diversity. And I'll just point out a few of the things that I've noticed so far. The first is that the total flux ratios vary widely among all of the different codes, anywhere from 4 out to 26, which is kind of a huge variation. The mean charge, and ion distributions also vary, maybe not quite as much, but there is some diversity among those predictions as well. And if you start to look at some of the detailed spectroscopic predictions, there are some interesting questions that start to emerge. So I'll just point out 3 of them. The first is that the neon-like 3F and 3G lines are strongly predicted by all 4 codes uniformly, but I don't observe them in my data, which I think is most likely an indication that the charge state distribution diverges from what we're seeing in the actual plasma. Only Prism Spect, one of the codes, predicts significant sodium-like emission, sort of in this region, some of which seems to match the data and some of which doesn't. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, XR predicts very weak neon-like 3E and fluorine-like 3S to 2P transitions compared to all 3 laboratory codes. And so the question is, of course, why? Why is this particular discrepancy so apparent? And so all of these sort of discrepancies are prompting some interesting theoretical work, some of which is ongoing, some of which is we hope to do in the future, including things like model-to-model comparisons at optically thin conditions to give us a more apples-to-apples comparison of the underlying atomic data. And then ongoing work includes things like detailed comparisons of oscillator strengths, line shapes, excitation rates, etc., populating the upper states of these transitions in particular. And of course, it sort of calls for a detailed interrogation of the XStar's spectroscopic level grouping scheme. Okay, I am out of time, so I think I'll just run through very quickly some of the experimental work that we still need to do. Includes mainly 4 sort of components that we need to complete to sort of bolster the claim that claims that we're making as far as the model to data comparisons. The first is that we use a model input radiation drive to represent the Z-pinch spectrum. That's a theoretical sum of 3 different Planckians, but of course this the actual Z-pinch spectrum is not this featureless continuum, so we're going to measure that in the first half of next year. we'll expand the measurements to 5 to 6 shots from the 3 we have so far. We'll use the new time resolve spectrometer to better constrain the total emission time or the total integration time of the time integrated data. And then finally, look at sort of trying to establish better constraints on something called the crystal reflectivity curve. It basically gives you the efficiency of the dispersive crystal that we use in our spectrometers to put better, or to get a better handle on the absolute emission intensity calibration. Yeah, and I'll stop there. I guess I'll just end by saying this is probably fairly new for a lot of you, but hopefully, you know, we can start to have conversations as the platforms mature, and think about, you know, some other regimes or interesting astrophysical questions that we can help with and start to probe in the laboratory. And so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for that great talk, Patricia. We might have time for like one question.
Sorry.
Are there significant optical depth effects in the resonance lines?
Are there significant optical depth effects in the resonance line?
I think so. Yeah, I think for the particularly strong ones, yes. And that's really what's motivating sort of the call for model to model comparisons at optically thin conditions. So at much lower densities than we're actually seeing in our plasma in the experiment.
Okay, great. I think a lot of people have a lot of questions, so I would you to sign up for a meeting time with Patricia, because we have to move on to our next speaker. So let's thank Patricia again.
Thank you, everyone.
You're going to which line?
Yeah, of course.
We have to yeah, we have to
So that people can like see you. And then
okay. Can you hear me well? Okay. So yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for allowing also CFA postdocs to give a talk at the seminar. So yeah, I'm Paola Dominguez Fernandez, and I'm a future faculty leaders fellow here who just arrived this February. And today we will be talking about the modeling of synchrotron emission in galaxy clusters.
You have the mic here.
Yeah, that's what I was asking for.
If you're young, you can put this in your pocket, but it's gonna try to be central because you're gonna turn your head. So
Yeah,
maybe a bit.
like there.
Yeah, try. Can try and speak.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So we find magnetic fields everywhere in the universe at all scales, from planets up to the largest gravitational systems that we know that are galaxy clusters. And focusing on galaxy clusters, we find magnetic fields in the intracluster medium. So the definition of the intracluster medium is that it is a hot, diffuse, magnetized, high beta, weak collisional plasma that is permeating the space in between galaxies and galaxy clusters. Now, this ICM amounts up to 15% of the cluster's math budget. And when we take a look, the magnetic energy of this ICM only amounts to just 1 to 2% of the total thermal energy. And so you might ask yourself, like, why should we care about magnetic fields? Well, here the key word is that this plasma is weakly collisional. If we take a look, the mean free path in the presence of magnetic fields in the ICM is of about 10 kiloparsecs. This is huge. And so in this type of plasmas, magnetic fields do affect a lot of the transfer processes. And so even though they are energetically not dominant, they are definitely not a passive component. Now, the radio diffuse emission that we observe in galaxy clusters has extensions of megaparsec scales, and it usually comes in two flavors. So on one hand, we have what we call radio relics. So you see here those in red, and these are usually located at the outskirts of galaxy clusters. They have this kind of like elongated shape because we believe that they are tracking merger shocks, and they are highly polarized up to 65%. And we believe that the particle mechanism that is actually powering this radio emission is called the diffusive shock acceleration. On the other hand, we have what we call radio halos. So radio halos are located more at the center of galaxy clusters. They tend to have kind of like a more roundish morphology that tends to coincide with the X-ray emission, and they tend to be unpolarized. And here, the particle acceleration mechanism that we believe that is powering this radio emission is called turbulent reacceleration. And so in order for us to understand this radio diffuse emission in galaxy clusters, it's really important to understand the two ingredients for these, which are magnetic fields and cosmic ray electrons. So there are many questions that are still open. So on the side of magnetic fields, we would like to understand how do magnetic fields reach the observed microdose values? What is their origin? How is it possible to get large-scale coherent magnetic fields of the order of tens of kiloparsecs? And on the other hand, on the side of cosmic ray electrons, we would be interested in understanding what particle acceleration mechanisms can actually explain observations, and what is the origin of these cosmic ray electrons. So here we have the problem that we can actually give an estimate on the diffusion length scale of the synchrotron emitting electrons, and this is just about 10 parsecs. So if you can see, this is way, way smaller in comparison to this huge radio diffuse emission that I told you that is has an extension of the order of megaparsecs. So basically, this is telling us that in order to explain observations, we need some kind of like in situ particle acceleration mechanism, or we need a source of already pre-energized cosmic ray electrons. Now, most of my research has been actually focused on like more the origin and evolution of magnetic fields, but today I will be talking more about the cosmic ray part. And I will be focusing more on radio relics. So as I mentioned before, we believe that the mechanism that is powering these radio relics is called this diffusive shock acceleration. And the idea that you have here is that you will have a particle that will have a zero radius that will be larger than the shock width. So in this sense, this particle will be allowed to move between the upstream and the downstream of the shock. Another thing is that at each crossing, this particle will be able to gain some energy. So at the end, by doing many crossings, this particle could be finally be accelerated up to cosmic ray energies. And so more into details, what is happening here is that in the part of the downstream, we have MHD turbulence that is excited by the crossing of the shock. And when you have the presence of MHD turbulence, you can scatter and deflect charged particles. Now, at the same time, we have that fast-moving charged particles can actually create alpha waves. So what is happening in the upstream is that these energetic particles are being scattered off by these alpha waves that they are generating themselves, and this is deflecting them back to the downstream. So we are having this kind of like random walk happening. And then the beauty of this theory is that by the end, the particles that are already being energized will be characterized by a final energy spectrum that can be modeled just as a power law, where the power law index that you see here just depends on the speed difference between the upstream and the downstream, which can be rewritten in terms of the Mach number of the shock. Give me a second. And so once you have an energy power law, you can compute the spectrum of the synchrotron radiation, which will also be a power law in frequency. And so you will have you will find that what radio astronomers do really often is that they will take observations at different radio frequencies and they will try to find this spectral index alpha. So whenever they do that, they can use this DSA theory and they can infer the Mach number of the shock. So usually you will see spectral index maps that look something like that. So what you are seeing here is the part of the shock front where you are having the fresh injection of electrons that are being accelerated and injected into DSA. So that's what I explained before. Here is where the particles acquire this power law in energy. But shortly afterwards, these particles will be vectored towards the downstream and they will be allowed to lose some energy. That would be in the form of synchrotron losses, inverse quantum losses, adiabatic losses. And so this translates into their spectra steepening. So this is what we call aging. And this is translated in the spectral index maps when we see that there is this gradient. And this is one of the characteristics that we always see in radio relics. Now, the other characteristics that we see in radio relics are related to polarization. So we usually observe that the polarization E vectors are aligned with the shock normal, and we usually also observe that the polarization fraction is highest at the part of the shock front, and then it depolarizes towards the downstream. So now if we think about simulations, it is practically impossible for us to simulate at the same time galaxy cluster scales and plasma scales. And when you are thinking about modeling synchrotron emission, you care about the spectral aging that I just described before. And so one novel solution is to work with a hybrid numerical framework. So what we need is first we need an MHD simulation, and then on top of that, we will need tracer particles. Each of these particles will represent an ensemble of cosmic ray electrons, and each of these particles then will be characterized by an energy spectrum in energy that can evolve in time by solving a Fokker-Planck equation. So that means that the third ingredient that you will need is a Fokker-Planck solver. Now, during this talk, I will be just talking about DSA and shocks, which means that this term here of turbulence is ignored, but I will just mention towards the end of the talk that I am working right now on including all of the terms in this from this Fokker-Planck solver in some new projects that I'm doing here at CFA. Now, right now we are starting to have a lot of new observations, particularly at low radio frequencies, and they are with high resolution, and they are starting to show that these radio relics actually have more substructure. We have a lot of open questions, but the question that we wanted to focus on first was what is producing the substructure in radio relics? Now we know from cosmological simulations and from observations that the intracluster medium is turbulent. So our first test that we wanted to do is just to set up a shock tube, placing in the pre-shock a turbulent medium that will be representing the intracluster medium. And as I mentioned before, here we are just caring about the particle acceleration at the shock, and then caring about the energy losses afterwards. And so here I will talk about the fresh injection model. That is when you have thermal electrons that are being injected into this DSA mechanism. So the first thing to notice, and it's pretty obvious, is that whenever you place a pre-shock that is turbulent, these will naturally induce some substructure in your synchrotron emissivity. So what you're seeing here in this synchrotron emissivity box on top is that you have a lot of substructure, but also you can observe that this is not volume filling. And why is that? So even though, sorry. So what is happening there is that at the shock front, not all of the particles will have enough energy to participate into this DSA mechanism. And so without going a lot into the details, what is actually giving the substructure here is the Mach number distribution, because whenever you are propagating a shock into a turbulent medium, you will have a distribution of Mach numbers. Obliquity, and indirectly it will depend on the pre-shock turbulence that you are putting. And some of the substructure will be seen in the spectral index maps. Now, sometimes we do observe these shocks also in X-ray, not always, but when this is the case, we try to infer also the Mach number with X-ray observations. And what's funny is that there tends to be a discrepancy where you can see here the observations where the radio derived Mach number tends to be biased towards larger values than the X-ray Mach number. So what we tried to do here we have all the information from our shock front. We know the Mach number at each of these cells. So we did some base statistics to get the X-ray emissivity and the radio emissivity at each of these cells. And we just saw that the fact that you are having a turbulent medium naturally induces a bias in the radio emissivity distribution that will tend to peak at larger Mach number values. This was later confirmed in another work that was done in my previous group, where in this case we took cosmological MHD simulations. We also modeled radio relics, but in this case we were taking more care about the X-ray part. So we were trying to do the extraction of the Mach number in a way that X-ray astronomers would do. And that means that you would extract a profile, and out of this jump that you see here, then you can infer the Mach number of the shock. And so the conclusion was the same, that so actually these two Mach numbers are not going to be the same, and the radio Mach numbers are going to be biased towards larger values. Now, another thing that I told you is that we want to reproduce other characteristics of radio relics, which are in polarization. So we care about having a high polarization fraction at the shock front, depolarization at the downstream, and polarization in vectors that are aligned with the shock normal. And all of these three we could get with these type of simulations. And so here I am showing you a polarization fraction map. So what you can see is that in the very shock front, you are having a compression and amplification of the magnetic field. So here is a bit easier to get a higher polarization fraction. But then when you go towards the downstream, you are having some turbulence. And so this is depolarizing your source. So here you will have patches of different polarization fractions. Now, modeling polarization is actually really hard because you have many effects that can actually depolarize the source. And so two things that we wanted to check was the Faraday rotation effect and beam depolarization. So what you can see here is the mean polarization fraction as a function of the beam physical size. So as you would imagine, radio rays will get more depolarized the larger the beam size. But the dashed lines here are showing you the effect of Faraday rotation. So the effect of Faraday rotation depends on the observing wavelength, and it's strongest at the smallest frequencies. So it could be the case. So for example, here, the turbulent models that we use, they are practically completely depolarized when we include this effect. Nevertheless, when we go to higher frequencies, we start to see, we start to recover some polarization. And here I wanted to mention that it's pretty hard for simulators because all of the data points, and probably not all the data points, but almost all the data points that we have are already in these plots. Okay, so we don't have a lot of data in polarization because polarization is just hard in general. But I want to point out that if we were to have more polarization information, this would be probably one of the most powerful tools that we could have in order to kind of like get more an idea of what is the structure of magnetic fields at the location of these radio relays. And therefore, we could infer what is the structure of magnetic fields in the outskirts of galaxy clusters. So now that I have given you like all of the good aspects of this fresh injection model, it's time to go to the bad news. And the bad news is that this model, when we use this model in simulations, it is pretty hard to reproduce kind of like smooth radio substructures. And I put this in orange because now I will show you how this panorama changes a bit when we use the reacceleration model. And the other problem that we have, and that we already know, is that for really weak shocks, so we are talking about shocks with Mach numbers of the order of 2, these cannot really explain the observed radio power. And I would encourage you to, like check this paper if you are interested in that. So basically, in order to explain that, we just this model and DSA, what you would require is just unrealistic electron efficiencies. So like meaning that probably you would need like all of the energy of the shock being transferred to the electrons in order for you to actually explain the radio power, or you would need a super large magnetic field. Now, here I finally want to mention one project that I have been working on with some collaborators. So here we wanted to check what's the morphology when we compare these two models, the fresh injection model and the reacceleration model. So what you're seeing here is the synchrotron and the CVT boxes, and it becomes already pretty clear if you compare these boxes to these boxes that in the reacceleration model is way easier to reproduce smoother radio structures. And this is the case because in the reacceleration model, what you are having is that you are inputting into this DSA mechanism electrons that are already pre-energized. So this means that you will have more possibility for these particles to be injected into DSA. So the emission will be more volume filling. And finally, what we were trying to do is trying to check how this emission will change in a broad range of frequencies. So what we did is that we studied the relative surface brightness variation of the radio maps. And what you're seeing here is basically the standard deviation of that as a function of frequency, where we consider very low frequencies, namely low frequencies, 150 megahertz or so. and up to really high frequencies like 18.6 gigahertz. So we're talking about single dish radio observations. So we just wanted to check if we could obtain like some relation. And so what is important here is that this is telling us that this is an increasing function with frequency. And basically, here you can already notice that the fresh injection model gives a higher increase than the reacceleration model. So this is basically putting like everything that you saw in the pretty pictures into an actual plot. And basically the reason is trying to explain that is by taking a look into this plot here, where I am plotting the radial luminosity over the cosmic ray energy. And so basically, if you take a look, a Mach number 2 shock, and then compare it to a Mach number 5 shock, the differences between these two is very large. So we are talking about 4 orders of magnitude difference. And so these differences here are explaining basically what we would obtain in the fresh injection model. And so I know this is a lot of details, but what we are trying to propose here in this paper is just another way on how to extract information about the Mach number distribution of these shocks, about the particle acceleration mechanisms, and indirectly, maybe we can get also more information about the turbulence in the intracluster medium. And yeah, with that, I finished. So I know this was a lot of information and nobody here does probably this topic. But here are some takeaway messages, and I just wanted to mention that there are some ongoing and future projects that I'm working on right now. So one of them is I'm trying to simulate the radio emission between bridges of galaxy clusters that are about to merge. So far there are like 4 new observations that are detecting these bridges in radio. And another one is trying to go to smaller scales and more mainstream stuff. So so trying to figure it out, what is the role of AGN bubbles and how these would interact whenever there is a galaxy cluster merger. And with that, I would like to thank you.
We might have time for 1 or 2 questions. Richard.
About the kind of substructures that you're talking about, the kind of size distribution of the substructures that you see, have you found that they're like related to any properties of the, are they like related to the turbulent maximum? Or
The sizes, so the sizes were a bit, so we did try that, but the thing is that it's kind of like hard to measure like the sizes itself. So what we tried was to compare, for example, the power spectrum of the radio emission with, for example, the magnetic power spectrum. But unfortunately, that was really hard to tell. So like the best thing that we can do is basically get a relation between the properties of the free shock turbulence, such as the RMS Mach number. Also in magnetic field, with the magnetic field, you could do that, but you would need to go to polarization. And then get the characteristics at the shock front. So at the shock front, it's where everything is happening, because that's where you are injecting the particles into the DSA. And so basically these fluctuations will kind of like will dictate kind of like the width of this Mach number distribution. And with that you can, yeah, you could in principle infer that. Now here we just work with 1 and 2 turbulent models, so I couldn't find a relation, unfortunately, but probably with a larger parameter space, you could find something else.
So kind of related to that, do you care about the specific geometry? Is it like a smooth shock front, or do you have like a ripple shock? Do you care about the physics of like the shock normal, especially with a magnetic field, or does that not matter with your small magnetic field?
Do you mean like for the initial conditions or like the outcome that I want to get?
Yeah, especially for the outcome, like
Yeah.
a lot in like supernova and
Yeah, yeah.
where the shock acceleration is closely related to the orientation of the magnetic field, the shock normal.
Yeah, so you would care because like, so if you see here, this kind of like, okay, it has a lot of substructure here and there, but this is pretty smooth. This is pretty smooth, and this is something that you cannot really reproduce so easily in simulations.
Right.
And about the magnetic field, yeah, you do care because when you have also polarization, observation of polarization, we get really ordered polarization E vectors. So we also would want to reproduce that.
All right, I think we have to end here because there's another group coming in shortly, but I would also encourage you if you have questions to sign up to meet with you. You'll be around, I'm sure.
Yeah, it works here. So.
Listen to our speakers again.